Doom released in 1993, and everybody talks about what a big breakthrough that game was, because, well, it was a big breakthrough. But there's a first-person shooter game that came out just 1 year later that was way ahead of its time, yet so few people know about it. I'm talking about Magic Carpet. The Bullfrog Productions team went all out on this game. We're talking VR support, 3D glasses support, even stereogram support, which I'll get into a little later. But let's talk about the game itself. Now, I want to focus on the game dynamics, so I'm going to skip the storyline stuff. The entire first-person experience exists on a magic carpet flying on a spherical world, so it was a game that allowed for complete freedom to explore whatever map you appeared in. Now, at the time, this was insane. I mean, even Doom 2, which was another amazing game in 1994, kept you in these boxed rooms. The way the Bullfrog Productions team managed the CPU and memory was to make the distance visibility foggy, and this way it didn't overload the otherwise puny DOS computers. Now just think about how forward-looking this was. This is 1994, and the game developers were literally telling you to go explore anywhere you wanted on the map without boundaries. First-person shooters almost always bounded the player's environment because it made it so much easier to manage CPU and memory. Even games that simulated freedom of movement still had a mission path that kept things easily bounded. I remember hearing about Crysis a full 13 years later being so innovative because of the non-linear first-person player mission paths. And by the way, I'm sure that in the comments, people will come up with a ton of earlier examples than Crysis. That's just the one that comes to mind. Now, I'm not going to lie, this created some serious CPU and memory challenges. I'll talk about that when we go over the DOSbox settings, because I want you to play this game. The game dynamics take some getting used to. You got to be patient with yourself because in the beginning, you'll be frustrated with the whole thing. But trust me, push through the frustration and you'll begin to love this game. Now, in the gameplay, you'll be designating spells for both your left and right mouse buttons. The foundational spells are to build a castle and claim your mana. Now, if you have a castle built and you die, you'll reappear at your castle. But if you die without your castle, you're dead, and you'll have to start the whole level over again. Claiming mana makes it so that you're more and more powerful, and this is how you progress on each level. Your castle stores the mana that you claim by dispatching a balloon that goes out and picks it up. Now, if your mana storage at your castle maxes out, you can grow it by casting another perimeter wall around your castle, complete with its own guards, which is so cool. The same spell that claims mana can also claim town buildings, which means that people in the town will establish their own army and fight on your team. And the town constructs new buildings that dynamically change the landscape, which brings up another topic. The entire landscape responds to what you do. You can set the forest on fire, create a volcano, shoot out of a canyon path, or blemish the land with a fireball. Just a reminder, this is 1994, way ahead of its time. Okay, to beat the level, you have to collect enough mana in your castle, and you'll have this little indicator which will tell you how much you need to store in your castle. Now, this game was fully intended to be multiplayer, but I think they got ahead of themselves on this part of the game because I've never figured out how to make that happen or played it in a multiplayer mode. But you can tell that in the gameplay, they were planning to put this in because, for example, you can chat with the non-player characters. And this brings us to the enemies in Magic Carpet. Yes, there are other carpet riders with their own castles and balloons competing with you. And yes, they will claim mana just like you can, so you're constantly dealing with their pesky persistence and taking your mana. But outside of that, there are some really well thought out enemies with their own dynamics and behaviors which are really cool. Now, you can attack other players' castles, and when you destroy one of the perimeter walls, it dumps out a bunch of mana. And you can also play defense when players are attacking your castle. Okay, so how do you get your hands on this game? If you want to go through the official publisher that acquired Bullfrog, then you need to go to EA. You can buy Magic Carpet from EA for just $5. But there's a bit of a catch. EA didn't exactly put a ton of sweat equity into packaging up this game. They distribute it with DOSbox, and their DOSbox configuration needs a lot of TLC. But trust me, you'll get your time and money's worth. In order to edit the DOSbox.conf file, I had to use the administrator command line to open the file. Otherwise, EA has made this file uneditable. ChatGPT can walk you through that whole process. You'll want to monkey with a few of the settings here. For example, if you're running on a really large screen, you'll likely have to edit the screen resolution settings, and you can set a distinct pixel count here. Keep the command line call to the configuration file handy so you can go back and forth and get something that works. I personally have a giant 49-inch monitor, and I wanted to be able to play within a window that took the full vertical space but maintained the native aspect ratio of the game. Without going into every setting, I'll just put the settings that I put together right into the video description. And while we're in DOSbox settings, we need to talk about memory. You're going to need to jack up the memory allocation because the EA team gave it a paltry 16 megabytes of RAM. Now, I don't think that this would be such a big problem if everybody ran it at the CPU clock speed of 1994. But if you're like me and you want to crank up the clock speeds dramatically, then I think this can impact the cycles in which the townspeople reproduce, which means that the game is tracking more things and therefore it starts monkeying with the actual gameplay. So for example, you won't be able to launch any spells anymore. So I cranked up the memory to the maximum 64 megabytes of RAM, which completely resolves the gameplay. Now, part of the reason I like to crank up the CPU cycles is because Magic Carpet developers included a high-res version of the game. If you press R on the keyboard, it will take you into that resolution, which no computer at the time could run. So just for some context, I got this game when I lived in Brazil, and at the time, we probably had the highest performing computer in the entire country. It was hand-built by my brother that worked for Novell, and he put in the latest and greatest parts that money could buy, and it's still loaded with the high resolution. It's still loaded maybe 2 to 10 frames per second. So it was really slow. So it was very, very high res for that time. So depending on, what you're doing in the game, it'll be really, really slow or, slightly faster. Again, it's a testament to how insanely forward-looking the development team was. But on today's computers, you can crank up that CPU speed and it runs smooth as butter. And it does have a variable CPU speed, so if you're looking at something really intense or doing something really intense, it's kind of like Minecraft, you're exploding all these things at once, it will slow the frame rate down. If you look up at the sky, all of a sudden the frame rate just cranks up. At any rate, when you're in the game, you can adjust the CPU speed from DOSbox by clicking the Shift F12 to increase it and Shift F11 to decrease it, or you can just go in the config file and give it a distinct number. Another in-game set of adjustments that you'll need to annoyingly pick are the audio settings every time you use the game. This was something they really screwed up on the Bullfrog side. Remember, this is a very early game, especially in the first-person shooter world. So you're just going to have to pick these as you start your game. You can just pick the standard Sound Blaster compatible stuff and the first option of everything that it gives you, and it should do just fine with DOSbox's emulation. Like other games of that era, the directional keys are the arrow keys. And like Dopes, the EA team locked down the DOSbox key mapper, so you have to play the same way. In addition, if you're accustomed to inverted first-person panning on your mouse, you'll have to adapt to non-inverted gameplays. So for some, this is just the last straw and they give up. But if you play for just like 20 minutes, your mind will completely adapt to the new gameplay. Now, you'll want to look at what the different keys do in the archived manual, which I have taken the time to hunt down and I've left in the video description. Okay, last thing. If you want to try out some of the 3D stereogram features, you'll toggle these with the F10 button. It's mostly just a gimmick, but it's fun to try out. I'm assuming you'll need to use the old style blue and red 3D glasses. I don't think you can use the modern glasses. Also, when I told my kids that the game supported stereogram gameplay, they couldn't quite figure out what I was talking about. If you've ever seen those weird staticky images that people stare at until they see a 3D object inside, that's what a stereogram is. And you can play the game in that mode. And it's really weird, but definitely worth a try. The VR support, on the other hand, was designed for the Forte VFX-1.
It's no wonder Forte Technologies and the VFX-1 are emerging as the leader,
which basically doesn't exist anymore, and I don't see any pet projects to emulate its hardware on Oculus. But I'll close with this. If there ever was a game that deserved to live in VR, this is it. So in a way, this video is a plea to VR developers. Please make this game. It would be insanely entertaining, and with that, I bid you all farewell. And if you like this video, show me, and I'll consider doing more stuff like this.